In this next part of the lecture, I'm going to build upon some of the notions that we've already defined in this talk, in this exploration, and show you the work of other people as they try to capture the shape properties of performances, mostly other people's performances, and in one case, the author's own performance, my own, as it happens. So let's proceed to the slides and think hard about analyzing shape in musical performance. Researchers over many years now have spent a lot of time and effort trying to capture the shape-like properties in people's performances. And a range of very interesting and sophisticated softwares has been developed for this purpose. I'm going to show you the fruits of their labors, as I said. The first is using Audacity to try to capture the overall sound envelope. And we get a sense over the passage in question, a performance by the pianist Ashkenazi, of the rise and fall of the sound volume, if you like, not just the dynamics, but the overall sound envelope, as we say. This is also implicit in the next slide, which shows a range of data for different performances, again capturing the rise and fall of energy, if you will, of the sound properties in the aggregate. If you would imagine, as the piece proceeds, a kind of decline there and so forth, these different attacks, rises and falls and so forth, that gives you a sense, if you will, of the topography, the feel of the performance as it proceeds. This one more demonstrative in this passage than this one, for example, that kind of thing. I'm not going to go into the details of these different studies, but just to give you a sense of how shape has been modeled in a number of fashions. This is a spectrographic analysis, a very detailed analysis of the sound properties, looking at the fundamentals and the partials, the overtones as they go up the spectrum. At the top, you have a dynamic curve, so louder as it goes up and softer, more quiet as it goes down. And with this very detailed work, you can show how, say, singers or violinists or whatever use vibrato meaningfully, or portamento. You can show how the color of music is created in ways that we can't hear in precise detail, but which certainly affect our hearing, affect what we are picking up from the performance. This very detailed work was used in a study on Schubert's song performance, looking at expressive gesture as part of a previous research center called Charm. So this technique, using a software called Sonic Visualizer with spectrographic analysis and capturing the dynamic flow of the music, this software allows you to get right down to the fine detail of a performance, which you then have to interpret. The facts of the performance, as revealed by these different softwares, always have to be interpreted. You cannot take them at face value. Now, this is a very different type of data. This set of data reflects tempo fluctuation in a performance by Claude Debussy himself of his Prélude La Cathédrale Engloutie, 1913. You can see the rise and fall of tempo, getting faster, getting slower. As the graph goes up, the tempo's getting faster, with a couple of main tempo levels around which the tempo fluctuates. Now, as I said before, this captures the facts of the performance. This is exactly what Debussy did, as far as we can tell, based on a piano roll, a technology which itself was somewhat less than accurate all of the time, but we have that to go on and we can look at it and draw conclusions from it. What is important to recognize here is that when it goes up or down, we may not actually hear it that way as listeners. We may interpret it differently. How much do you need to go up or down for it to become palpable, to become audible? That's a question that will depend on the individual as much as anybody. So when I show you these different diagrams, just bear in mind that they cannot be taken at face value. They always have to be interpreted, as I've suggested. A similar sort of study was done by Nicholas Cook, looking at two performances of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler. This shows a broad similarity between the two performances, which took place at an interval of 2 years. This again is tempo fluctuation. And the author of the study, Nicholas Cook, showed that there was a broad logic to these tempo fluctuations that formed these large arches that I've shown you here. This is a fascinating study showing not only the durability of interpretations over time, but the planning that takes place at some level on the part of the performer in creating sense through performance, in this case, sense through temporal fluctuation. This diagram shows tempo and dynamic fluctuation captured using MIDI data. This is a Chopin prelude, the E minor prelude, opus 28, number 4. Again, two performances compared by the researcher Eric Clark, showing some divergences as well as a great deal of similarity. We have tempo at the bottom and dynamics at the top. Now, as I said a minute ago, it's important to recognize that these data, although factual in a sense, at least as factual as anything can be, are not necessarily what we hear. And we don't hear these things in isolation at all. We hear them as a sum total, and that's something I'm going to talk about in a minute. This is the same pianist's performances, but with an additional layer of data, and that has to do with the pianist's head movements. They put lights on the pianist's head and tracked his head motion and determined that he tended to have head nods at particularly important moments in his interpretation of the Chopin prelude. Clearly, we would need a lot more time to get into the detail of what this study told us, but you can get a sense already of the ways in which shape, whether dynamic, temporal, physical, or whatever, the different ways in which shape have been modeled. Here's a similar study in some respects. This has to do with a clarinetist who was asked to perform pieces by Stravinsky in 3 different manners: normal at the top, exaggerated expression in the middle, and immobilized at the bottom. You can see at the bottom with the immobilized version that it's not absolutely stationary. We have involuntary movements and necessary physical movements in playing an instrument. Those you cannot escape from, whereas in the case of the normal and exaggerated modes of performance, there's a rather striking similarity between them, which itself is interesting. This has to do with the end of the clarinet, the bell of the clarinet. Again, there was a sensor there which allowed the researchers to track the movement, and you can see that in the normal and exaggerated modes, the bell of the clarinet moved a great deal more than in the so-called immobilized version. I'm going to show you now a couple of slides from a study of 9 pianists who were asked to play Chopin preludes, in this case, the prelude in B minor. These are motion profiles capturing the data from a number of light points on the pianist's bodies. And you can see that the motion profile depends very much upon the individual performer. So this performer has a much tighter kind of bodily motion than, say, this one or whatever. In fact, just about everybody has more physical motion than this particular pianist had in performing the prelude. In the detailed study that was undertaken by these 2 researchers, important conclusions were drawn about the understanding of phrase structure on the part of these pianists. And I don't have time to get into the detail, but at least on the face of it, we can see that there are different types of motion vocabulary according to the individual musician in question. This is true also in the same study of both head motion and torso motion, 2 separate performers tracked over time, playing the same prelude with a kind of notional spine in the middle, showing the degree to which they moved around that. Think about your own playing, the ways in which you move. You will actually yourselves have particular motion patterns that are part of your own personality as a performer, your musical personality as a performer. Sometimes these are involuntary, sometimes they are well studied and practiced, such as the closing gesture at the end of a piece. But within the piece itself, your body is going to move in particular ways distinctive to you, which could, as these researchers have done, be tracked. And then one final example, which is very different from the others. The others are based on sophisticated technologies, sophisticated softwares. This is a drawing that I made of my own performance of Liszt's ballet Dobermann. What I did was to play through my own performance in my mind and then sort of trace the rise and the fall of the overall energy, or I called it intensity, over the course of the piece. Now, this is not a scientific method. It doesn't claim to be a scientific method, but what it does try to do is capture something that's really, really difficult to encapsulate in words or indeed in any particular diagram. What it tries to show is the overall surface of the performance, the topography, the way in which the energy levels rise and fall. Now, we know that pianists and other musicians have these sorts of large-scale shapes in them. And think about it if your teacher were to say to you, no, you're rushing the climax. You're getting to the climax too soon. That suggests that you're sort of going too far ahead of yourself and moving this far up the thing rather than taking the more gradual approach shown here. Or somebody said, no, you need more energy as you approach this, or more ritardando or whatever. You have to have a sense at some level as a performer of how that kind of control is exercised, of how the music should flow. That's a very subtle thing that we don't fully understand. But this diagram tries to capture it, an imagined performance showing the overall shape. Not scientific, but it's something that you could try yourself. Just try imagining one of your own performances. Maybe close your eyes and play it through. It's very difficult not to lose time, by the way. And then trace the rise and the fall and try to keep a kind of broad consistency in a background level so it doesn't just go off the page. See what you come up with. So these different diagrams representing different projects, different approaches, try to capture in visual form the shape of performance defined in terms of tempo, dynamics, physical movement, the overall trajectory. None of them is perfect, and none of them really in itself captures everything. There's much more detail that we need to consider, and the ways in which the notes, the phrases add up needs to be considered as well. Let's look at that very point in the next part of the lecture, which starts with scores and then builds from them towards broader conclusions.